Newly appointed AID Director, Ms. Christina Jordan. Mr. Al Merkel with AID. Keith Peterson with USIS. Peace Corps volunteers, members of the new EC 57 training group. Welcome you to a very special session that we are beginning this morning. A session, unfortunately, that we had to delay because of the ambassadors being in Washington, D.C., visiting with a gentleman by the name of George Bush. For some reason, took priority over our visit. I'm not sure why. But we're certainly pleased now that the ambassador is with us. He is a gentleman that certainly is committed and interested in everything that Peace Corps is all about. Very much a believer in our organization, and it's certainly a pleasure to have him with us. So I'm just going to say a few words about his background and then turn it over to him, because we do want to make sure that he has time to visit with you and have an exchange. Ambassador Phillip Hughes assumed his current duties as ambassador to Barbados, the Commonwealth of Dominica, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent, and the Grenadines on November 8, 1990. Immediately before assuming this position, Ambassador Hughes served as the Executive Secretary of President Bush's National Security Council in February 1989. Prior to that, he served as the First Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Export Enforcement and as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs. Ambassador Hughes first worked for President Bush between 1981 and 1985, and he was then Vice President Bush's Deputy Assistant for National Security Affairs. In September 1985, he joined the National Security Council as Director of Latin American Affairs with responsibility for the Caribbean and Mexico. The ambassador has also held positions dealing with international security policy at the Department of Defense, the Brookings Institution, and the Congressional Budget Office. After earning his BA in Political Science from the University of Dayton in his hometown of Dayton, Ohio, Ambassador Hughes went on to earn an MA in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Tufts University, and a Master's of Public Administration at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Beyond all of that, a very qualified gentleman. We are certainly pleased to have him with us. And at this point, I'm going to introduce and turn it over to Ambassador Hughes. Ambassador Hughes.
Dick, thanks for welcoming me to what has been planned, I suppose appropriately, as a traditionally formal West Indian presentation, introduction, centerpiece, vote of thanks. At the risk of causing your training director fits and of causing you all to retrogress, I'd like to step out of my mode for a moment and sit down in the first place. And I hope that doesn't obscure your view too much, because I'd like this to be a much more informal session than our cultural surroundings would normally dictate this be. And just share with you a little bit my sort of thinking, and I hope accurately our government's thinking about this region, the Eastern Caribbean, where you're going to spend the next couple of years of your lives working for further development of peoples of this region, further advancement of their societies, in the process being a collection of individual ambassadors of the United States to the people of the Eastern Caribbean, carrying on a long tradition of that service and that ambassadorship here, but also making, I think, yet another step in our continuing contribution to the economic advancement and development of countries of the small island Caribbean. Let me, if I could then just sort of make this a little bit more informal. I suppose I should start with an apology. I very, very much wanted to come, I'll use this mic, I think it probably does help people here in this hall. I very much wanted to come and visit with the PCV trainees this summer, and already back, I think, in the spring, Dick and I were inscribing this on my calendar for, as I recall, the 28th or 29th of last month. It was a firm fixture there until Eugenia Charles asked to visit President Bush in Washington, Prime Minister W. Some of you will be going to Dominica. You will surely have a chance to meet her. She'll probably ask you for something. And so that became infeasible. We had a chance to meet with my deputy, Barbara Owens. I know he came over for that occasion to stand in for me. And Dick and I concocted an idea on the phone that, well, if I could meet with Peace Corps volunteers at the outset of the 3-week training period here in Lucia, maybe I could meet with you off the back end as you concluded. As it turns out, I'm going to be in Washington on your last day here as well. So this seemed to be the best day, and I hope you don't mind taking a Tuesday afternoon to spend with me and talk a little bit about the region. How many of you have lived abroad previously? How many of you would say that you traveled extensively abroad? How many of you have lived in the Caribbean or traveled extensively in the Caribbean previously? Say you can. Most of your experiences in traveling abroad is where? Europe, Latin America, Asia, Africa. Okay, a bit of everything. Let me tell you a little bit about my perspective on the Caribbean, sitting over in Ridgetown, where otherwise the had an interest in management decisions of the Peace Corps to try to bring this program closer to the countries where we're actually delivering services and so forth. We'd be doing this in Ridgetown, in a relative lack of luxury in the Eastern Caribbean, a much more developed place, a place that graduated from needing Peace Corps assistance a long time ago, Barbados. But from the embassy of Ridgetown, of course, it is a regional embassy. The officers of the embassy cover the entire island chain of the Eastern Caribbean, from St. Kitts and Nevis north to Grenada in the south. Many of the officers have responsibilities that range beyond that to larger territories like Trinidad for our military liaison and defense attaché offices, and Venezuela at the moment for our legal attaché, and Guyana and Suriname, for example, for the aid program that Lucia Jordan, who's sitting in the back, is now assumed the direction of. For my part, I don't cover all of that territory. I cover 3 islands of the Windward chain under the current arrangement that we have, that is to say, Dominica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and also Barbados. But also through the regional coordination activities that we do in Ridgetown and through my own attendance at various regional meetings, I have a chance to have a pretty complete overview of the Eastern Caribbean region. There are some places that I see less distinctly and am exposed to less frequently than others, but a pretty complete overview of the region. So I suppose I'm in a reasonably good position to comment on sort of our government's policy and how we approach this region. From a policy point of view, the Eastern Caribbean, as we look into the 90s, I think one of the things that you can say is that the 90s for our policy in the Eastern Caribbean are going to be very different from the 80s. We may not be able to predict the future with certainty, but I think one thing we can predict fairly confidently is it's not going to be anything like the 80s were here in the Eastern Caribbean. What do I mean? At the end of the 1970s, and as we came into the decade of the 80s, just about say this time, 10 years ago or a little earlier, this was an area that had a lot of problems. The most dominant problems from the perspective of Washington, I think, were probably security problems. At that time, Governor Grenada had been deposed in a coup, a sort of strongman government. Prime Minister Gary had been replaced by a government strongly backed by Cuba, strongly, therefore, supported by the rest of the Soviet bloc. It was opposing sort of installing kind of Marxist-oriented government there, not through any kind of elected or democratic process, and building up a little armed force, small, a giant in Eastern Caribbean terms, but small in world terms, and also, of course, building an airport that had some significance to it, we thought, would have had significance had it been completed under those conditions. There were radical movements operating in a number of islands here. We knew that Cubans and Libyans were providing support to a number of radicals in the area who, by constitutional or maybe unconstitutional means, extremists, were interested in taking over the governments. The economies of these islands were very fragile. They had limited potential for foreign exchange earning. They could be monocrop economies, dependent on bananas, spices, or tourism, or sugar. They tended to be at a competitive disadvantage because of their small size. They tended, in a sense, to be ripe for some kind of unrest. And this area is very close to us. It's an area where it's in our backyard. We can't afford, we reckoned in the 80s, afford to be indifferent to the fate of these people on humanitarian grounds. We couldn't afford to see this chain of islands or a group of these islands become themselves hostile or become the agents of people who are hostile to us. That wasn't a desirable state of affairs. So in the 1980s, there was a very concentrated, I would say, period of ahistorically high concentration, policy concentration on the Caribbean in Washington. It's not an exaggeration to say that the doings in Jamaica, in Grenada, in St. Lucia, in Dominica, in small islands here, were very much on the desk of the President in the Oval Office, before the attention of the Vice President and the Secretary of State, the subject of innumerable meetings, the subject of specially designed presidential travel or meetings, special initiatives to try to address the problems of the region. I lived through those days in the White House. I remember what working on Caribbean policy was like at that time. And there was a sense that we really had to do something, working with the governments of the region, working with other cooperating countries to make a turnaround, to not consign this region to the instability and turmoil, the threat to democratic government that did engulf it. I mean, even Speaker Brzezinski, President Carter's national security advisor before he left office, described what he called a red tide washing the Caribbean. Not everybody is comfortable with that imagery, but it gives a sense of the atmosphere at that moment. We responded, I think, the United States as a government, along with other countries, Canada, the oil facility that was created at the San Jose Accord by Mexico and Venezuela to supply, and Trinidad to supply this region. A number of countries responded, but we particularly responded to try to help this area deal with its problems of instability and also of economic weakness. Chiefly through the President Reagan's Caribbean Basin Initiative, we tried for once, maybe a time that maybe a unique experiment, to design a program of incentives that were uniquely tailored to small island economies and also small economies of Central America, which is part of the Caribbean Basin, to provide one-way free trade access for non-traditional products to encourage diversification into the United States market, initially for 12 years and now with recently enacted legislation on a permanent basis, to increase assistance levels for the region, which were stepped up dramatically in President Reagan's early years and then sustained for several years at a quite high level before beginning to tail off and decline in the late 80s. And to extend a tourism benefit we originally sought, to extend an investment tax credit to attract investment to these small islands so that we would have basically a tax write-off if we made an investment here, but Congress didn't pay for that. So instead we went for Congress wrote into the law a so-called tourism incentive, which basically is a convention tax exemption for business conventions held outside the United States and these islands, provided the islands have signed certain tax agreements with us. We later on tried to enrich this initiative with some other things, with access to 936 so-called development funds, loans from Puerto Rico at more favorable interest rates for investment in the region, more generous treatment of textile imports from the region, which President Reagan announced being available to the region in his visit to Grenada in early 1986. That's what we were doing on the economic front, try to open new opportunities for these countries to sort of earn their way in the competitive world, provide them better access to our market, and so sort of help support the economic underpinnings of democratic governance in these islands. On the political front, we supported and encouraged the governments that were democratic to remain so. And on the security front, the island governments themselves, along with some support from ourselves in the United Kingdom, created a thing called the Regional Security System, which continues to operate today, a collection of coast guards in each individual island. Coast guards are about 35 people apiece, and we provided the major Coast Guard patrol craft, two Boston whaler sort of outboard motor open boat kind of craft for sort of essential Coast Guard patrols. The countries had no Coast Guard defenses at all, practically to that point. And the formation of a paramilitary squad, a little more heavily armed, a little more militarily trained within the police force, but as part of the police force, to provide a kind of emergency reaction capability. Why? What did the RSS do? Well, this individual island capability at least provided an insurance policy against the repetition of what had happened in Grenada in 1979. That is, a dozen or so armed guys grabbing a few strategic points and toppling the government. I mean, through a quite unconstitutional and not necessarily popular process. And it also provided the ability of the islands to come to each other's aid, to embark their police unit on their Coast Guard vessel and sail over to the next island in case the Prime Minister called for help there. The RSS was a very small investment for us as these things go, a few millions of dollars. It's operated successfully for now almost 10 years. The MOU was signed in 1982. It's amazing how far that institution has come in 10 years. I remember coming here to the Caribbean in 1985 for a conference over in Barbados, when the then Prime Minister, the then opposition leader of Barbados and soon to be elected Prime Minister, Joe Barrow, gave a speech decrying what he feared was the militarization of the Caribbean through this initiative. Imagined, I think, somehow it would grow into small armies on these islands and social resources would be channeled down an unproductive path of security and military expenditure. That hasn't happened. Not only did that not happen, I mean, the RSS today is exactly the same size and exactly the same capability. It's just a little more cohesive than as it was when the outlines of this thing were first imagined in the early 80s. But what has happened is that the governments, many of, in some cases, the former oppositions are now the governments. The governments of the region have come to really appreciate the value of the RSS. A lot of the misgivings about it have disappeared. People have embraced the regional security system. In fact, the recent meeting of the Council of Ministers, Prime Ministers of all these countries that was held in Barbados about 3 weeks ago, will soon, I think, lead to the signing of a new, more legally firm memorandum of understanding among these countries to continue the system. Its day-to-day responsibilities have metamorphosed from security and sort of counter-coup insurance to fighting the counter-narcotics fight, and dealing with the counter-narcotics threat. But it always provides an in-being capability for search and rescue, for disaster assistance, something that, of course, aid also plays an important role in, and where our aid effort has to interface with the regional security system when it comes to delivering disaster assistance in the case of, say, a hurricane striking Montserrat, as occurred a little while back. And, of course, an insurance policy against a kind of a coup threat or a threat of domestic violence or instability. While the ideological threat to democracy in the Eastern Caribbean has receded greatly since the 1980s, after the Grenada rescue operation, which was really a threshold development in the Eastern Caribbean. Among other things, it signaled a larger share of responsibility for the United States for the fate and the future of these islands, and a somewhat lesser role for Britain in its historic colonies. It also sent a shockwave through the radical elements and the anti-democratic forces that were then operating in the Caribbean, and they basically went to ground. I mean, they dried up, and their threat is not great at all today. But the Trinidad coup attempt last summer reminds us that we can't take anything really for granted, and the island governments were all reminded that they can't take anything for granted. That it's always possible for some small, determined, disaffected group to make an attempt at unconstitutional change of government. And therefore, fortunately, the governments, with our help and our support, maintain some capability to cope with that contingency. Small investment, prudent investment in the regional security system, and it's an investment, I think, that continues to pay dividends for the governments of the region. Not just as an insurance policy, but day-to-day in coping with the problem of drug trafficking that they have. That's all about the 80s. What are we doing in the 90s? I would say that the 80s was a period when we devoted unprecedented, perhaps, attention to the Eastern Caribbean, high-level policy attention. When we created with the island governments, we built institutions, we built new capabilities, we launched new initiatives. It seems to me that the 90s in this region are more likely to be a period of consolidation and of preservation. Preservation of the gains that have been made through the 80s and continuing advancement along the lines that are already laid down, but without quite that same concentrated policy attention in Washington. You can't count on Eastern Caribbean or Caribbean issues to be, a weekly feature of the president's intelligence diet or a weekly feature of meetings or the White House or something of that sort. Frankly, there are other challenges in the world that help us to distract our policymakers' attention. The challenge of Eastern Europe, the challenge of peace in the Middle East, the challenge, of course, of the Gulf War that was concluded earlier this year. In that environment, it's difficult to sustain the kind of attention to the Eastern Caribbean that we devoted in the last years. And frankly, since many of the problems of the Eastern Caribbean in the security realm are sort of behind us, it stands to reason that we would be sort of approaching this region a bit differently now than we were 10 years ago. What do I mean by consolidation and preservation? Well, these countries have recorded impressive gains in the 1980s. Growth rates in these economies have averaged in the range of 5 to 7% per annum in the Windward Islands, sometimes even greater. That's pretty good. Prime Minister Charles went into the Oval Office Friday a week ago, and said to the president, and he asked, how are things going in the country? Well, not so good. Growth is only going to be 4% this year. He said, I wish I could say that. Now, admittedly, Dominica is growing from a very different base from the United States. But 4% growth is not shabby. And 5 and 6% is definitely not shabby. And the cumulative impact of that kind of growth over a period of a decade is apparent to people who've been away from the region for a long time and are now coming back. My deputy served here from 1980 to 83, Barbara, who we met a couple of weeks ago. She's impressed when she comes back to Lucia, which was the island that she used to cover as a political reporting officer, at how much things have changed and how much the standard of living and quality of life has improved. That's why I asked you at the beginning, how many of you traveled extensively and have a lot of foreign experience? Because if you have a good comparative perspective on the Caribbean, you might find it a little bit of a little hard to get your bearings or focus on this as a developing part of the world, because if you come at this as an American who's never had any experience of traveling in the third world, of course you will be impressed with the underdevelopment and pockets of poverty and the narrow base of the economy focused on bananas or things of that sort. You'll be impressed with, the perhaps aged infrastructure or the need for further infrastructure improvements and development, better school or more sophisticated school and things of that sort. But if you have a lot of experience, as some of our aid people do, I was reminded of a speech given by one of our departing aid personnel a few weeks ago, where from an aid perspective, he said this wasn't the best assignment, it wasn't the worst assignment, but one of the things that made it not the best assignment was that these were medium developed countries, or medium underdeveloped countries. We're not talking about Haiti, or Mali, or Burkina Faso, or some extremely backward or extremely poverty-ridden, endemic